What follows is a list of core definitions for the nomenclature used in Jungian Neuropsychoanalysis and Psychosystems Analysis, written by Steve Richards. This video is intended for reference purposes only. Use the timestamps below to find the definition that you're looking for. Infodynamics. In psychosystems analysis and Jungian neuropsychoanalysis, infodynamics is the revision and extension of psychodynamics beyond psychoreductionism, as psychoreductionism was defined by the Dialectics of Biology group in their book Towards a Liberatory Biology, edited by Stephen Rose and published by Allison and Busby in 1982, into superpositioned informational field theory, or superpositioning theory. Infodynamics is therefore the dynamic representation of information within any state or level that it can generate or occupy, from the lowest to the highest ontological and phenomenological registers. So this includes all psychodynamic structures, processes and dynamics found in depth psychology, and their field coherence and interactions with information in any other state. The conventional modelling of the conscious and unconscious divisions of the mind are transcended by an understanding of infodynamic field representations and translations. Models of mind-body dualism, including dual aspect monism, are likewise resolved. Infodynamic super-determinism. In psychosystems analysis and Jungian neuropsychoanalysis, infodynamic super-determinism refers to the simultaneous causal relationships within an informational field that are caused or determined by the interaction of the field with itself, resulting in a state change to that field. A given field, say a complex, may also be superdetermined by factors arising outside of itself, for example through interaction with or meta-regulation by another field. The principle of superdeterminism can accommodate strict linear causality, or quantum effects, acting in concert on different constituent elements of a field of informational representation and dynamic expression. Psychosomatic Storm. In psychosystems analysis and Jungian neuropsychoanalysis, a psychosomatic storm refers to a superdetermined field effect that acts upon the field of a whole organism via transduction pathways, reference to Rossi and Richards, to cause a representational pooling of effects downstream of any initial change in state of that field. Specifically in psychosomatic effects, following the influence of suggestion, in any form, including compound influences summating as a field in itself. A change in the ego field of a subject can distribute by transduction out from the psychosocial field into biology, whilst escaping conscious attention at the ego field level. With sufficient collapse of individual autonomy and increasing compensating homeostatic pressure from the genome and its instincts, a psychosomatic storm of representational symptoms and disorders may follow. At a lower valency of effect, this explains the routine presentations in cases of classical hysteria, somatoform disorder, and conversion reactions in medicine and depth psychology. In the case of a psychosomatic storm, the depletion of homeostasis is so great that multiple disorders may appear at the psychological and physiological levels, with extensive disruption to psychosocial adaptation. Politically directed top-down constraints of the natural freedom of a population will be a powerful trigger of downstream psychosomatic storm effects, as defeat and despair are leveraged to maximize compliance. Informational field. In psychosystems analysis and Jungian neuropsychoanalysis, an informational field is a heterogeneous field of informational states that are connected, so held together relationally, by association to one another. Such fields are not therefore homogeneous, as in the singular electron field in physics, composed only of electrons. Rather, they are fields of associative interaction that can exchange energy and information within and between themselves, and so change through such interaction their composition and both their representational and associative states. For example, the field of a complex can be represented by stretching its effects over the biopsychosocial stack, thereby revealing its field nature at and between all affected levels. Consciousness. Psychosystems analysis defines consciousness to be a complexity of information that represents itself to itself, and then represents itself to other complexities of information. This baseline definition is derived from informational monism and superposition theory, which is a Platonic ontological modelling of consciousness as such, and is a priori to the collapse of consciousness into human ego consciousness. Taken overall, consciousness is a dynamic informational field phenomenon that exists in many simultaneous superpositioned states, with each state being a nodal point of collapse of representation of consciousness, with that collapse defining any given state or organized system as being that state or system, and the intra or inter-relational fields within and between them. The Miller number field, the 7 ± 2 chunks of information processing capacity that make immediate conscious awareness. The persona field, the dynamic two-way interface between the individual organism and any two-person and above relational interaction, extending out into the collective socio-cultural and natural environments. Unlike in Jung's model, the persona field is not seen as something unreal or only consciously constructed as an ideal mask, hence the name persona. Rather, it is a component of the whole ego field that has first evolved and then functionally adapted as the psychosocial interface between the individual and others. The self-image field, the internal mirror that is subjectively experienced as the representation of personal identity. In effect, this is the ego's internal persona. It reflects back the ego's referent understanding of itself to itself. It is both tacit and implicit, requiring either direct internal checking through the Miller number in order to become explicit, or for its representation to emerge autonomously into the Miller number. So the self-image is unconscious to reflexive awareness unless it is either A, deliberately accessed, or B, intrudes autonomously. The self-image can update itself continuously, but will have a nucleus of identified with self-referent information, drawn from the continuity of the field of the self-concept over the timeline of the individual's ongoing lifespan development. It functions as the defining focus of the field of the self-concept, when the ego field reflexively examines itself. The self-concept field. That field of systematized information which extends back along the individual's timeline, containing every subjective experience that has ever been identified with by that individual as being them or involving them relationally. This includes all biopsychosocial states that have ever been associated to the ego's developing sense of identified with reflexivity. Biopsychosocial states are configurations within the objective waveform of the Platonic field that also include all subjective ego field states, or ego states, of the subjective waveform of the ego. So, an ego field state, or ego state, represents a transitory or sustained configuration of the ego field, sufficient to cause either partitioning into a Jungian complex, thereby generating the complex's self-directed autonomy, or of forming a persistent representation of itself, which is incorporated into the self-image as the dynamic focus of the self-concept field. Those autonomous complexes that the ego identifies with form that part of the complex field incorporated into the field of the self-concept, and its focus, the self-image. The majority of the contents of the self-concept field are consolidated into long-term memory, and are unavailable for recall by the ego's conscious will or intention, but are subject to psychodynamic and field infodynamic processes that may introduce or return them into association to the ego, either in whole or in part, and are capable of activation by directed homeostasis. The complex field. That field of partitioned, systematized information that forms in response to the ego's lifespan developmental experience. There are 3 taxa of complex within this field, all of which form through Jungian dissociation and regulating infodynamics. Ego-identified with complexes, ego-aligned complexes, and ego-non-aligned complexes. All of these taxa may exchange energy, whether that be libido, metabolic and instinctive, and information, so infodynamics, within and between themselves, either to internally regulate the content of their relational field or in response to meta-regulation by various homeostatic processes. In this way, they may change their taxa in relation to the ego field. The ontology of complexes always concerns adaptive responses to internal and external challenges along the lifespan. Internal pressure arises from the genome as pansepian drives and timed release meta-instincts. External pressure is anticipated by both pansepian and meta-instincts. The result are complexes as variously systematized into optimal, suboptimal, or maladaptive fields of association. Typically, complexes form around key relationships and anticipated scenarios for adaptive challenges. Psychosystems analysis differs from Jungian psychology in that it considers meta-instinctive fields and pansepian drive pressure, rather than archetypes, to be the underlying organizing factor through which complexes form. The ego partitions and devolves functional responsibility to its partitioned subsets, that is, to ego states that form as complexes for a specific devolved purpose. In this, they have an adaptive evolutionary advantage, which comes at the cost of potential neurosis, or severe mental illness. Not all complexes are maladaptive. Those that are not may simply be inertial, such as in having been long ago consolidated into long-term memory and function as non-declarative learning, or are effectively dormant. Others that are positive in adaptive function may be held in a tacit or implicit identification with the self-image. In such cases, these positive ego-identified with complexes act appropriately through the ego's action in the world and receptivity to inner experience. The ego has the capacity to internally project aspects of its experience, learning and self-referent identity into and over the non-ego conscious, or the unconscious. The homeostatic response to this is to generate deep structure complexes. These deep structure complexes respond to and attempt to correct for the ego, but do not form within the complex field of the ego. These specialized complexes, called the alter ego and the moral complex, which are analogous to some extent with Jung's shadow and Freud's superego, arise as a necessary ontological consequence of the development of the ego field. Each is a field of systematized information that relates homeostatically to the ego field. Through their role, they can co-opt or functionally partner with deep structure complexes and with Jungian complexes of all taxa. The dream ego, the representational form and reflexive experience of the self-image, as that has transitioned from the waking ego or normal state and into the dream process. Both waking and dream ego states share the self-concept and its foci of the self-image. Likewise, they share the same ego identified with complexes, which, being associated with the self-concept and its self-image, are necessarily drawn into the narrative structure of the dream state. The qualia of consciousness, the ontological and evolutionary qualia of consciousness, ranging from intuition as ground state field consciousness up through interoceptive and exteroceptive, analogous to Jung's introverted and extroverted sensing, respectively, to affect, as defined by affective neuroscience and neuropsychoanalysis as a priori to cognition, up to cognition itself, as being the most recently evolved cognitive function, analogous to both of Jung's feeling and thinking functions. Feeling, for Jung, was an affect-toned rational function. In psychosystems analysis, the Jungian feeling function is cognitive, but with a receptivity to superpositioned affect, absent in pure thinking, as Jung models that to be. The ego represents its experience of itself and the extended internal and external environments through any and all of the post-intuitive qualia of consciousness. Under normal conditions, intuition cannot represent itself as itself. it must collapse into one or more of the other representational qualia. However, under the special conditions of advanced dissociative training and practice, both Eastern and Western traditions, it is possible to escape the limitations of informational collapse into the post-intuitive qualia of ego consciousness. This advanced dissociative experience also increases the bandwidth of the Miller number internally. Altered states of consciousness. Any state of ego consciousness that partitions under natural or directed or substance-based processes that include Jungian dissociation, hypnosis and hypnoidal states, dreams, meditation, reverie, fantasy, imagination, creativity, dysregulated substance-induced brain chemistry, mental illness, and any other normal or abnormal field state or states that alters ego consciousness away from its Miller number focus of attention. Altered states of consciousness allow the ego to become reflexively aware of superpositioned informational field states that would otherwise not be registered. The emergent ego-field. The ego is an emergent field released ontologically in relationship to innate anticipations and experience. Its field is distributed into several superpositioned subfields: the Miller number, the persona, the self-image, the self-concept, the complex field, and the dream ego. The ego is therefore not localized into a single place in the brain, although the brain's evolutionary development does map the integrated and superpositioned field nature of the ego, as this is immanent with the development of the brain at the neurophysiological level. This means that the ego is simultaneously all of its superpositioned subfields, as these are dynamically distributed informationally and materially. Our everyday understanding of the ego as being conscious and being the subjective I that experiences moment-to-moment reflexive awareness is only a partial focal collapse of its overall field. Informational monism and superpositioning define the emergent field of the ego. Homeostasis. Homeostasis is the definition of ego strength, the capacity to maintain its functional field integrity and ongoing adaptive purpose is why, as a species, we've evolved the ego that we have. To go beyond its base level of function is possible. For this, we must understand and utilize the field nature of consciousness as information, and entrain controlled dissociation and reassociation.